James Rodriguez had planned this to be a quiet afternoon. At 62, retirement from the Seattle Police Department had given him the luxury of unhurried coffee breaks and peaceful moments to read his newspaper without the constant buzz of radio calls and case files demanding his attention. Rosie's Café on Pine Street had become his regular spot, a cozy establishment where he could watch the world go by through large windows while enjoying their excellent Colombian blend. But old habits died hard, and even in retirement, James found himself unconsciously scanning faces, noting behaviors, and cataloging the subtle signs that separated the innocent from those with darker intentions. It was a skill that had served him well during his career in missing persons and child protection services, and apparently it wasn't something he could simply switch off. The afternoon crowd at Rosie's was typical for a Thursday, minus business people grabbing quick meetings over lattes, students with laptops claiming corner tables, and the occasional tourist consulting their phone maps between sips of overpriced specialty drinks. James had settled into his usual spot near the back, newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle, when the odd pair by the window caught his attention. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked expensive. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his posture suggested someone accustomed to authority and respect. But it was his companion that made James's instincts prickle with unease. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She had long, dark hair that looked like it had been recently brushed and styled, and she wore a pristine white dress with small blue flowers. On the surface, they could have been grandfather and granddaughter enjoying an afternoon outing, but something about their dynamic felt fundamentally wrong. James folded his newspaper and pretended to check his phone while observing them more closely. The girl, whom he decided to call Luna based on a crescent moon pendant around her neck, sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. Her posture was unnaturally rigid for a child her age, the kind of careful positioning that spoke of strict instruction rather than natural comfort. The man, meanwhile, maintained a constant low-voiced monologue that James couldn't hear from his distance, but Luna's responses were minimal. Occasional nods, brief whispered words, but no animated chatter or natural conversation that one would expect between a grandfather figure and his granddaughter. Instead, there was a formality to their interaction that seemed forced and uncomfortable. James noticed how Luna's eyes would periodically scan the café, as if looking for something or someone. When their gazes briefly met across the room, he saw something that made his chest tighten, a flash of desperate hope followed immediately by disappointment when she realized he was just another stranger. The man reached across the small table and placed his hand over Luna's. From a distance, it might have appeared affectionate, but James saw how the girl's shoulders tensed at the contact. She didn't pull away. In fact, she seemed almost paralyzed, but every line of her small body radiated discomfort. James had seen enough frightened children during his career to recognize the signs: the rigid posture, the hypervigilance, the way she seemed to be holding her breath. This wasn't a child enjoying a treat with a beloved relative. This was a child who was scared and trying very hard not to show it. The man excused himself to visit the restroom, speaking quietly to Luna before he left. James watched as the moment the man was out of sight, the girl's entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she looked around the café with more obvious desperation. That's when she did something that made James's blood run cold. Luna placed her palm flat against the window beside their table and slowly spread her fingers wide, holding the position for several seconds. It was a gesture that most people would dismiss as a child's random fidgeting, but James recognized it immediately. During his years working with child protection services, they had taught this signal to children as a silent way to ask for help when they couldn't speak freely. The hand signal for "help me." James felt his heart rate increase as training and instinct kicked in. He had encountered this situation before. Children who were being trafficked or abused often found themselves in public spaces, but were too afraid or closely watched to call out for help verbally. The silent signals had been developed specifically for these circumstances. He looked toward the restroom area and saw the man washing his hands at the visible sink, taking his time and occasionally glancing back toward their table. James realized this might be his only opportunity to make contact with Luna while she was unobserved. Moving casually, James walked toward the counter as if to order another coffee, but instead took a route that brought him close to Luna's table. As he passed, he made eye contact with her and very quietly said, "I'm a police officer. Are you safe?" Luna's eyes widened, and for a moment James thought she might speak, but then she glanced toward the restroom and quickly shook her head. a barely perceptible movement that could have been dismissed as fidgeting. But her eyes told a different story. They were pleading with him to understand. "Do you need help?" James whispered, pretending to look at his phone. This time, Luna's nod was more definite, though still subtle. James felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with protective anger. His suspicions had been correct. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly, "but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what you normally would do. Don't let him know we talked." Luna nodded almost imperceptibly, and James moved on to the counter. He ordered another coffee he didn't want, using the time to formulate a plan and keep an eye on both Luna and the restroom area. The man returned to the table moments later, and James watched as Luna immediately resumed her rigid posture and folded hands. The transformation was heartbreaking, from a scared child seeking help to a perfectly controlled little robot in the space of seconds. It spoke to conditioning and fear that made James's jaw clench with suppressed fury. James returned to his table and discreetly pulled out his phone to call 911. He spoke in low tones to the dispatcher, identifying himself as a retired police detective and describing the situation. The dispatcher assured him that units were being dispatched but asked him to continue observing and reporting if anything changed. As James waited for backup to arrive, he continued watching the pair. The man seemed to be growing impatient, checking his expensive watch repeatedly and speaking more urgently to Luna. James couldn't hear the words, but the girl's body language became even more tense, if that was possible. Then something happened that made James realize they were running out of time. The man stood up and helped Luna with her small purse, clearly preparing to leave. James knew that once they left the cafe, finding them again would be infinitely more difficult, if not impossible. Making a split-second decision, James stood up and walked directly to their table. "Excuse me," he said with a friendly smile. "I couldn't help but notice this beautiful young lady. She reminds me so much of my own granddaughter." The man's smile in return was polished but didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you. Luna is indeed a special child." "Luna? What a lovely name," James said, directing his attention to the girl. "How old are you, sweetheart?" Before Luna could respond, the man answered for her. "She's 8, but rather shy around strangers. We were just leaving, actually." "Of course," James said, but he didn't move away from the table. Instead, he looked directly at Luna. "Do you like it here, Luna? This is one of my favorite places." The girl looked up at him with those same desperate eyes he had seen earlier. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the man quickly interjected. "She's not much of a talker. Come along, Luna. We don't want to keep Uncle Robert waiting." It was a mistake. The man had inadvertently revealed information. Uncle Robert. James filed the name away and noticed that Luna looked confused at the mention of this uncle, as if she had never heard the name before. "Well, it was lovely meeting you both," James said. But as they prepared to leave, he deliberately dropped his keys near Luna's chair. As he bent to pick them up, he whispered quickly, "Help is coming. Stay close to people." Luna's eyes widened slightly, but she managed to maintain her composure. The man, meanwhile, was becoming visibly agitated by James's continued presence. "We really must go," the man said, his politeness becoming strained. "Of course," James replied. But he had bought enough time. Through the cafe windows he could see 2 police cars pulling up to the curb. "Actually, would you mind if I asked you something?" The man's patience was clearly at an end. "I'm sorry, but we have an appointment to keep." "It'll just take a moment," James insisted, and then he played his ace card. "I'm a retired police detective, and I have some concerns about this situation." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The man's face went pale, and his grip on Luna's shoulder tightened visibly, making her wince. For a moment, James thought he might try to run, but then the cafe door opened, and 2 uniformed officers entered. James made eye contact with the officers and nodded toward the table. They approached professionally but cautiously. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said. "We received a call about a possible welfare check. Could we speak with you for a moment?" The man tried to maintain his composure, but James could see sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't understand. Luna is my granddaughter. We're just having coffee." "I'm sure it's nothing," the officer said diplomatically. "But we'd like to verify some information if you don't mind. Could I see some identification?" "This is ridiculous," the man protested, but he reached for his wallet. As he did, Luna took the opportunity to move slightly away from him, positioning herself closer to James. The officer examined the man's identification. "Mr. Harold Weston. And this is Luna Weston, your granddaughter." "Yes, of course." The officer looked down at Luna. "Can you tell me your full name, sweetheart?" Luna looked between the man and the officers, clearly terrified but trying to be brave. In a small voice, she said, "My name is Luna Reyes." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold Weston's face went from pale to ashen, and James saw him tense as if preparing to run. "Mr. Weston," the officer said, his tone becoming more official, "we're going to need you to come with us for some questions. Luna, can you come with Officer Martinez here? She's going to make sure you're safe." What happened next confirmed every suspicion James had harbored. Harold Weston suddenly bolted toward the cafe's back exit, pushing through other customers and causing a commotion. He didn't make it far. The second officer was already positioned to intercept him, and within moments, Weston was on the ground in handcuffs. Luna, meanwhile, burst into tears and ran directly to James, wrapping her small arms around his legs. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for seeing me." James knelt down to her level, his own eyes wet with emotion. "You did everything right, Luna. You were so brave." As the officers led Harold Weston away, one of them approached James. "That was good work, Detective. How did you know?" James looked down at Luna, who was still clinging to his hand. "She told me, not with words, but she told me. She's been trying to tell someone for who knows how long." Officer Martinez, a kind-looking woman in her 30s, knelt down beside Luna. "Sweetheart, we're going to make sure you get back to your family. Can you tell me about your mommy and daddy?" Luna wiped her eyes and nodded. "My mommy's name is Maria Reyes. She works at the hospital. I was walking home from school when that man said he knew where my mommy was and that she wanted him to pick me up." James felt a familiar burn of anger in his chest. The same old tricks, the same vulnerable targets, the same predators taking advantage of children's trust and innocence. "How long ago was that, Luna?" Officer Martinez asked gently. "Yesterday," Luna said, and James felt his heart sink. This child had been missing for over 24 hours, and her family must be going through absolute hell. "Officer Martinez," James said, "I'd like to stay with Luna until her family arrives, if that's permitted. Sometimes having a familiar face helps." "I think that would be very helpful, Detective Rodriguez. Thank you." As they waited for Luna's mother to arrive at the police station, Luna sat beside James, still holding his hand. She had stopped crying but remained close to him, as if afraid that letting go might make her safety disappear. "How did you know I needed help?" she asked quietly. James smiled down at her. "Because you're a very smart girl, and you did exactly what you were supposed to do. Do you remember learning about the help signal in school?" Luna nodded. "Miss Peterson taught us. She said if we were ever scared and couldn't talk, we should put our hand on a window like this." She demonstrated the gesture again. "And you did it perfectly. That's how I knew you needed help." "I was so scared," Luna admitted. "That man said my mommy was hurt and needed me to come with him. But then he wouldn't let me call her, and he said we had to go see Uncle Robert. But I don't have an Uncle Robert." James squeezed her hand gently. "You don't ever have to see that man again, Luna. He's going to jail for what he did." When Maria Reyes burst through the police station doors 30 minutes later, the reunion was everything James had hoped it would be. Luna ran into her mother's arms, and both of them dissolved into tears of relief and joy. "Thank you," Maria said to James through her tears. "Thank you for bringing my baby back to me." James nodded, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came with a successful case, even in retirement. "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time." But as he drove home that evening, James reflected on how many children might not be as fortunate as Luna. How many silent pleas for help went unnoticed. How many predators moved freely through public spaces, confident that no one would intervene. Harold Weston, it turned out, was wanted in connection with several child abductions across 3 states. Luna's rescue had potentially saved not just her, but countless other children who might have become his future victims. James realized that retirement didn't mean his skills and instincts had to go to waste. There were still children who needed advocates, still predators who needed to be stopped, still families who needed their loved ones brought home safely. The next day, he visited the local police department to inquire about volunteer opportunities with their child protection unit. After all, as Luna had reminded him, sometimes the most important thing was simply seeing when someone needed help and being brave enough to act on it. Some instincts, James reflected, were too valuable to retire.